All right. This is I don't really know what I'm doing here. I think I always put myself in situations. Anyways, I think I'm doing this because I just want to force myself to read, uh, and then maybe as I'm reading, just kind of talk about things that occur in my mind. Kind of what I'm associating when I'm reading Kant. Uh, so I haven't, just to kind of give you guys a brief understanding, I haven't read this section yet. I only read the first little part, which is why it's highlighted. Other than that, I haven't read. So I think we'll read the first or second, maybe 2 pages. Maybe we'll see. Uh, don't want it too long, but I don't know. Who knows? Who knows? We'll see how this goes. So this is the section on Kant. He talks about the transcendental aesthetic. The second section on time. I just finished the one on space, which was really interesting. So let's get started. All right. So his first, I guess his first reasoning, first point. Time is not an empirical concept that is somehow drawn from an experience. For simultaneity or succession would not themselves come into perception if the representation of time did not ground them a priori. Only under its presupposition can one represent that several things exist at one and the same time, simultaneously, or in different times successively. Uh, I mean, I mean, for me, like first impression of this point from point from Kant, I want to say that I agree. uh, at least in my initial impression, and it doesn't seem like I have any problems with him talking about time is not an empirical concept. Uh, but the one interesting question that I have is, do people still agree with Kant on this? Uh, do people still agree with Kant on time and space being on intuition? That's the part that I couldn't help but continue to sort of ask myself as I began reading this. And so here on the second point, time is a necessary representation that grounds all intuitions. In regard to appearances, in general, one cannot remove time, though one can very well. Sorry, I apologize if you guys can hear my roommate. I'm going to close the door here a little bit. Okay, let's reread the second part. Time is a necessary representation that grounds all intuitions. In regard to appearances in general, one cannot remove time, though one can very well take the appearances away from time. Time is therefore given a priori. In it alone is all actuality of appearances possible. Is that right? In it alone is all actuality of appearances possible. The latter could all disappear, but time itself, as the universal condition of their possibility, cannot be removed. I find this interesting. I don't know. I don't know what to say about that. I don't know how I feel about that beginning, that second point. Um, he seems very certain about that time cannot be right. He says time cannot be removed. Yeah, time itself is the universal condition of their possibility cannot be removed. There's something that just like hits me there that I can't explain about. I mean, it is interesting the concept of time in general about when we look at it. I don't know. All right, so the third point. This a priori necessity also grounds the possibility of, I can't pronounce that word, apodictic principles of the relations of time or axioms of time in general. It has only one dimension. Different times are not simultaneous but successive, just as different spaces are not successive but simultaneous. These principles could not be drawn from experience, for this would yield neither strict universality nor, I don't know how to pronounce that word. I want to say I could probably pronounce it. Let me see. Sorry, guys. This is really bothering me that I can't pronounce this word right now. I want to say apodictic certainty. We would not only be able to say we would only be able to say this is what common perception teaches, but not this is how matters must stand. These principles are valid as rules under which experiences are possible at all, and instruct us prior to them, not through it. And then the fourth point, time is no discursive, or as one calls it, general concept, but a pure form of sensible intuition. I guess that's why he says you can't remove it. Different times are only parts of one and the same time. That representation, however, which can only be given through a single object, is an intuition. Further, the proposition that different times cannot be simultaneous cannot be derived from a general concept. The proposition is synthetic and cannot arise from concepts alone. It is therefore immediately contained in the intuition and representation of time. The infinitude of time signifies nothing more than that every determinate magnitude of time is only possible through limitations of a single time grounding it. The original representation, time, must therefore be given as unlimited, but where the parts themselves in every magnitude of an object can be determinately represented only through limitation. There the entire representation cannot be given through concepts, for then the partial representations proceed, but their immediate intuition must be the ground. Okay, so conclusion from these concepts, time is not something that would subsist for itself or attach to things as an objective determination, and thus remain if one abstracted from all subjective conditions of the intuition of them. For in the first case, it would be something that was actual, yet without an actual object. As far as the second case is concerned, however, time could not precede the objects as a determination or order attaching to the things themselves as their condition and be cognized and intuited a priori through synthetic propositions. But the latter, on the contrary, can very well occur if time is nothing other than the subjective condition under which all intuitions can take place in us. For then, this form of intuition can be represented prior to the objects, thus a priori. It says, for then, this form of intuition can be represented prior to the objects, thus a priori. And it says, time is nothing other than the form of inner sense. So this is the one contrast where he says that space is our outer sense, and then time is our inner sense, which is, I feel like there's something interesting there. I think I think if someone's creative enough, we could really play with Kant's notion of this inner sense and outer sense about time and space. You know, I don't know. I'm just thinking about if you purify, because what is it? I was talking to Daniel, or Daniel and Cadell were talking to me in an email about if you purify nothing, then it's being, and if you purify being, then it's nothing. I almost feel like we can make the same stab at time and space. It's like if you purify time, it's space. If you purify space, it's time. That would be interesting. I think that would be an interesting thought. I don't know. That's what I'm associating. But anyways, let's continue. So point B, time is nothing other than the form of inner sense. That is to say, of the intuition of ourself and our inner state. For time cannot be a determination of outer appearances. It belongs neither to a shape or a position, etc., but on the contrary determines the relation of representations in our inner state. But the contrary determines the relation of representations in our inner state. Okay. And just because this inner intuition yields no shape, we also attempt to remedy this lack through analogies. I feel like this actually, I really want to highlight this line. Just because it says lack, and I feel like there's something that we could probably pick apart later. I don't know. I'll have to look at this line a little bit more. So let's read it again. And it says, and just because this inner intuition yields no shape, we also attempt to remedy this lack through analogies, and represent the temporal sequence through a line progressing to infinity, in which the manifold constitute a series that is of only one dimension, and infer from the properties of this line to all the properties of time, with the sole difference that the parts of the former are simultaneous, but those of the latter always exist successively. From this, it is also apparent that the representation of time is itself an intuition, since all its relations can be expressed in an outer intuition. Time is the a priori formal condition of all appearances in general. Space, as the pure form of all outer intuitions, is limited as an a priori condition merely to outer intuitions. But since, on the contrary, all representations, whether or not they have outer things as their object, nevertheless, as determinations of the mind themselves, belong to the inner state, while this inner state belongs under the formal condition of inner intuition, and thus time. So, time is an a priori condition of all appearance in general, and indeed the immediate condition of the inner intuition of our souls, and thereby also the immediate condition of our outer appearances. If I can say a priori, all outer appearances are in space and determined a priori according to the relations of space. So, from the principle of inner sense, I can say entirely generally, all appearances in general, that is to say, all objects of the senses, are in time and necessarily stand in relations of time. Uh, okay. If we abstract from our way of internally intuiting ourselves, and by means of this intuition, also dealing with all outer intuitions in the means of, okay, so with all our outer intuitions in the power of representation, and thus take objects as they may be in themselves, then time is nothing. I feel like I gotta read that line again. It says, if we abstract from our way of internally intuiting ourselves, and by means of this intuition, also dealing with all outer intuitions in the power of representation, and thus take objects as they may be in themselves, then time is nothing. It is only of objective validity in regard to appearances, because these are already things that we take as objects of our senses. But it is no longer objective if one abstracts from the sensibility of our intuition, thus from that kind of representation that is peculiar to us and speaks of things in general. Time is therefore merely a subjective condition of our human intuition, which is always sensible insofar as we are affected by objects, and in itself, outside the subject, is nothing. Okay, I definitely want to highlight that, because I find that interesting. Okay, so he's saying that time is nothing outside of us as a subject. That's interesting. Um, that's interesting. Okay, so nonetheless, it is necessarily objective in regard to all appearances, thus also in regard to all things that can come before us in experience. We cannot say all things are in time, because with the concept of things in general, abstraction is made from every kind of intuition of them. I'm going to read that again. We cannot say all things are in time, because with the concept of things in general, abstraction is made from every kind of intuition of them. But this is the real condition under which time belongs to the representation of objects. Now, if the condition is added to the concept, and the principle says that all things as appearances, objects of sensible intuition, are in time, then the principle has its sound objective correctness and a priori universality. Our assertions accordingly teach the empirical reality of time, that is to say, objective validity in regard to all objects that may ever be given to our senses. And since our intuition is always sensible, no object can ever be given to us an experience that would not belong under the condition of time. But on the contrary, we dispute all claim of time to absolute um, reality, right? Namely, where it would attach to things absolutely as a condition or property, even without regard to the form of our sensible intuition. Such properties, which pertain to things in themselves, can never be given to us through the senses. Such properties which pertain to things in themselves can never be given to us through the senses. It is in this therefore consists the transcendental ideality of time, according to which it is nothing at all if one abstracts from the subjective conditions of sensible intuition. So he's repeating the same thing, saying that uh, if we abstract again from our intuition, then this time is nothing. Cannot be counted as either subsisting. Let me see. And this, therefore, consists the transcendental ideality of time, according to which it is nothing at all, if one abstracts from the subjective conditions of sensible intuition, and cannot be counted as either subsisting or inhering in the objects in themselves without the relation to our intuition. Yet this ideality is to be compared with the subreptions, subreptions of sensation just as little as that of space is, because in that case one presupposes that the appearance itself in which these predicates inhere has objective reality, which is here entirely absent except insofar as it is merely empirical. That is to say, the object itself is regarded merely as appearance, concerning which the above remark in the previous section is to be consulted. I think, yeah, I'll read this part too. Hmm. So, elucidation. Against this theory, which exceeds empirical reality, um, which concedes empirical reality to time, but disputes its absolute and transcendental reality, insightful men have so unanimously proposed one objection that I conclude that it must naturally occur to every reader who is not accustomed to these considerations. It goes thus: alterations are real. This is proved by the change of our own representations, even if one would deny all outer appearances together with their alterations. Now, alterations are possible only in time. Therefore, time is something real. There is no difficulty in answering. I admit the entire argument. Time is certainly something real, namely the real form of inner intuition. I actually really like this line. Time is certainly something real, namely the real form of inner intuition. It therefore has subjective reality in regard to inner experience. That is to say, I really have the representation of time and of my determinations in it. It is therefore to be regarded really not as an object, but as the way of representing myself as an object. Ooh, I really like this line too. I'm going to highlight that. So, it is therefore to be regarded really not as an object, but as the way of representing myself as an object. I feel like I could really play with this idea. I feel like there's a lot of ideas that's going to come from this line. Um, but if I or another being could intuit myself without this condition of sensibility, then these very determinations, which we can now represent to ourselves as alterations, would yield us a cognition in which the representation of time, and thus also of alteration, would not occur at all. Its empirical reality therefore remains as a condition of all our experiences. Only absolute reality cannot be granted to it according to what has been adduced above. It is nothing except the form of our inner intuition. I want to highlight this too. So, it is nothing but the form of our inner intuition. And then I'll read this here, this little asterisk. I can, to be sure, say, my representations succeed one another, but that only means that we are conscious of them as in a temporal sequence, accordingly to the form of inner sense. Time is not on that account something in itself, nor any determination objectively adhering to things. Uh, okay, so going back, let's let's reread the other line. It is nothing except the form of our intuition. If one removes the special condition of our sensibility from it, then the concept of time also disappears and it does not adhere to the objects themselves, rather merely to the subject that intuits them. The cause, however, on account of which this objection is so unanimously made, and indeed by those who nevertheless know of nothing convincing to object against the doctrine of the ideality of space, is this. They did not expect to be able to demonstrate the absolute reality of space um, apodictically, I think that's what it is, apodictically, since they were confronted by idealism, according to which the reality of outer objects is not capable of any strict proof. On the contrary, the reality of the object of our inner sense, of myself and my state, is immediately clear through consciousness. The former could have been a mere illusion, but the latter, according to their opinion, is undeniably something real. But they did not consider that both, without their reality as representations being disputed, nevertheless belong only to appearance, which always has two sides, one where the object is considered in itself, without regard to the way in which it is to be intuited, the constitution of which, however, must, for that very reason, also remain problematic, the other where the form of the intuition of this object is considered. So he's saying right here, so let's highlight the two sides. But they did not consider that both, without the reality as representations being disputed, nevertheless belong only to appearance, which always has two sides. One where the object is considered in itself. So I'm going to highlight that. The other where the form of the intuition of the object, the other where the form of the intuition of this object is considered, which must not be sought in the object in itself, but in the subject to which it appears, but which nevertheless really and necessarily pertains to the representation of this object. Okay. And he says, time and space are currently two sources of cognition from which different synthetic cognitions can be drawn a priori, of which especially pure mathematics, in regard to the conditions of space and its relations, provide a splendid example. Both taken together are, namely, the pure forms of all sensible intuition, and thereby make possible synthetic a priori propositions. But these a priori sources of cognition determine their own boundaries by that very fact that they are merely conditions of sensibility, namely that they apply to objects only so far as they are considered as appearances but do not present things in themselves. Those alone are the field of their validity, beyond which no further objective use of them take place. This reality of space and time further leaves the certainty of experiential cognition untouched, for we are just as certain of that whether these forms necessarily adhere to the things in themselves or only to our intuition of these things. Those, however, who assert the absolute reality of space and time, whether they assume it to be subsisting or only inhering, must themselves come into conflict with these principles of experience. For if they decide in favor of the first, which is generally the position of the mathematical investigators of nature, then they must assume two eternal and infinite self-existing non-entities, space and time, which exist yet without there being anything real, uh, only in order to comprehend everything real within themselves. If they adopt the second position, as do some metaphysicians of nature, and hold space and time to be relations of appearances, next to or successive to one another, that are abstracted from experience through confusedly, though confusedly represented in this abstraction, then they must dispute the validity, or at least the apodictic certainty of a priori mathematical doctrines in regard to the real things, in regard to real things, for example, in space, since this certainty does not occur a posteriori. I know I messed up that word. A posteriori. Yeah, I think that's right. Uh, and on this view, the a priori concepts of space and time are only creatures of the imagination, the origin of which must really be sought in experience, out of whose abstracted relations imagination has made something that, to be sure, contains what is general in them, but that cannot occur without the restrictions that nature has attached to them. Um, then he says, the first succeed in opening the field of appearances for mathematical assertions. However, they themselves become very confused through precisely these conditions if the understanding would go beyond this field. The second succeed, to be sure, with respect to the latter, in that the representations of space and time do not stand in their way if they would judge of objects not as appearances but merely in relation to the understanding. I think this kind of reminds me of why I like Kant, because he kind of I like that at least what he's doing right now, he's comparing two positions, uh, and he's giving the pros and the cons of both of them. But what I like is that ultimately shows the flaws in both, and he agrees that this is not enough, and this is what I really like about Kant in general. Um, so so it's admirable what he's trying to do here, for his time. Okay. So where did we leave off here? So let's go back. The second succeed, to be sure, with respect to the latter, in that the representation of space and time do not stand in their way, if they would judge of objects not as appearances, but merely in relation to the understanding. But they can neither offer any ground for the possibility of a priori mathematical cognitions, since they lack a true and objectively valid a priori intuition, nor can they bring the propositions of experience into necessary accord with those assertions. On our theory of the true constitution of these two original forms of sensibility, both difficulties are remedied. Finally, that the transcendental aesthetic cannot contain more than these two elements, namely space and time, is clear from the fact that all their concepts belonging to sensibility, even that of motion, which unites both elements, presuppose something empirical. For this uh, presupposes the perception of something movable. In space considered in itself, there is nothing movable. Hence, the movable must be something that is found in space only through experience. Thus, an empirical datum. In the same way, the transcendental aesthetic cannot count the conception of alteration among its a priori data, for time itself does not alter, but only something that is within time. For this, there is required the perception of some existence and the succession of its determination, thus experience. Um, all right. Wow. Yeah, that was really good. Uh, I actually really enjoyed that. Um, Kant's, uh, Kant's, just his whole just way he's viewing time and space. Um, I really like this. It's interesting, right? In space considered, he's saying right here, in space considered itself, there is nothing movable. Hence, the movable must be something that is found in space only through experience. Hmm. I think I'll read the little remarks at the bottom here. It says in Kant's copy, Leibniz's system of space and time was to transform both into intellectual but confused concepts. But from this, the possibility of a priori cognition cannot be understood, for in that case, both must proceed. And the Bravo one, B, the last one, inserted in Kant's copy, conclusion that space and time, of course, have objective reality, but not for what pertains to things outside of their relations to our faculty of cognition, but rather only in relation to it, and thus to the form of sensibility, hence solely as appearances. Um, all right, so that's the end of Kant's view and remarks on time. I think this next page will just be maybe more of his, like he calls it, general remarks. So, all right. Well, thanks. Thank you guys for joining me. This will get me to read and just think about Kant and time and space. Uh, are they really intuitions? I think Kant's argument. Uh, he always brings up He always brings up the mathematical argument. So I think that's why he really presses on space and time um, being a part of our intuition. But um, you know, I like that Kant makes it more. Uh, he makes it more complex rather than someone just saying like, time is just subjective or something like that. You know what I mean? Like people say these comments all the time, but Kant makes it way more complicated and way more complex, which I really enjoy. Or it's like time is of course he basically agrees that time is like subjective, of course, it accords with the subject, right? It accords with ourselves. um but it's really like the form. Time is the form of our intuition, the form of that inner intuition. So that's a little bit more complex than just saying that time is subjective. So I really like that. Um, and I like how it goes, like this time and space, space being more of the outer, our outer senses, and time being the inner senses, the inner experience as such. But then Kant says there's only one time, and then Kant only says there's only one space. So and that I feel like that's I don't know. I mean, I definitely don't have anything to argue against it right now. uh, so I'm just gonna simmer in it, and I don't think I don't think me reading Kant I'm gonna find anything to argue against necessarily right now. I think I just want to see what can I create out of me reading Kant, um, and so on. Uh, some concepts in terms of love, the concept of love I really want to challenge. Uh, I feel like there is something grounded a priori in the concept of love, but uh, and I trying to construct an argument for such a thing right now, but it's still hard. So we'll see. I'm probably gonna fail, but who knows? Because I I want to push the boundaries on this a little bit more, rather than just really presenting a phenomenology. I can't even pronounce the word right now. Phenomenology notion of love. All right. Anyways, thank you guys for watching. If you guys watched, if this inspires you to read or whatever, or maybe if you wanted to read some Kant with me, this is the way to do it. I guess I don't know, but thank you all for joining me, and I always appreciate it. All right, take care.